Hi, everybody. Welcome. We're just giving people a moment to kind of get into the Zoom room and then we'll start. If people want to introduce yourselves in the chat, with your name, if you're connected to an organization that you don't have to be, what brings you to this session. We're going to try to use it as a way to both build some connection, know what's on people's minds. So feel welcome to introduce yourself that way. Okay, I think we should get started. So I'm Rabbi Stephanie Ruske. I'm the Associate Dean in the Rabbinical School at JTS, and I also run our Hendel Center for Ethics and Justice at JTS. And I am here with a great team of people. We all work in different organizations and places. This is a session called Why and How to Divest Your Organization from Fossil Fuels. It's really an opportunity to learn. If you want to immediately run out and divest yourself, you're welcome to. But really, this is a beginning conversation that may inspire you to think about other people you think should be having this conversation. It's a little bit about normalizing the idea of talking about this so we could figure out what, if anything, we want to do about it. This is part of the Big Bold Jewish Climate Fest. There are so many webinars, performances, opportunities to engage throughout the weekend. So we are really glad you're here at this session, and we invite you to join any other ones that you want. As you'll see, we're recording. There has been a request. It's hard to be at multiple weddings at the same time, even on Zoom time. So you might want to share it with other people, and other people who were at other sessions now might want to hear it. So we're inviting you to use the chat to please introduce yourself, your name, if you're connected to a community or an organization, and what brings you to the session. So we may not be able to exactly touch on the thing that you're wondering, but it will help us be a little bit more related. Please keep yourself on mute. I know I have a lot of people Zooming in other meetings and in school right now in my house. You might also. So if there are any, interruptions here, sorry. And if you have any, try to keep yourself on mute so we can mainly hear the people who are presenting. This panel is organized by the Jewish Climate Coalition. It's 37 organizations. We are not a closed canon. If you are part of a group that would like to join, you are more than invited. We're trying to figure out how can we advance climate justice work in the Jewish community. Lots of different organizations do different pieces of it as their expertise. And lots of institutions don't have it as their primary area of focus, but they would like to do more together. We got together really around the climate strike a year and a half ago. We went together and decided that there was some real value to being in relationship with each other. And so you're welcome to join if you would like. And Morgan Long, who you will see here, is our most outstanding organizer and agitator and follow-througher, and she sort of keeps us going. Let's see, I want to just introduce the panelists. I don't think I know how to highlight them, but maybe they'll wave when I say their names. We have Mark Campanelli, the founder and executive chairman of Carbon Tracker. Rabbi Rachel Contraster, who's the lead strategist on TRUA's human rights campaign at TRUA, the Rabbinic Call for Human Rights. Nikhil Aziz, the director of Land, Water, and Climate Justice at American Jewish World Service. And Melissa Hoffman, who's an organizer of the Vassar Student Divestment Campaign. So we're going to get started. Each of them will speak some. You can react to them in the chat, and then we'll have as much of a conversation as we can afterwards. So Mark, would you kick us off, please?
It's evening here in London. I'm delighted to be joining you, and I'm going to speak for about 20-25 minutes with some questions, and I'm going to share my screen now, to just give me a second. So hopefully this has appeared, the entry slide. Is that correct, Morgan? You can see that.
Yes, and you're
Very
going
good.
on for 15 right now, right?
15. Yeah,
Sorry,
okay.
just
So
double checking.
yeah, there's some key messages I want to get across today about why people over the last 10 years have been divesting from fossil fuels. The movement has reached $14 trillion of foundations, endowments, individuals, and pension funds that have divested. And those who follow the Rockefeller Foundation, you will have seen their announcement today that they're divesting all fossil fuels from their $5 billion endowment out of New York. So some of the messages I want to get across is that there's a growing acceptance of the science around what we call carbon budgets, the need to limit the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And it's actually these limits, which are scientifically based, and I'll talk about some of them, which have created the potential to destroy the business plans and values of the existing fossil fuel industry. Quite simply, we can't burn it all. And the fact that most fossil fuels will need to stay in the ground creates a new type of risk to investors. And it's a risk which the markets are increasingly understanding. But it's not just the risk of having to keep fossil fuels in the ground. And just living in London and watching the announcements from the new Biden administration is quite astonishing, really, just how badly hit the oil pipelines are and prospecting for oil across the US is going to be. But it's going to be clean technology, not just a moral imperative, but clean technology that's also going to win. And I'm going to talk in a few minutes about that. And the thing to remember is that investors don't lose their money when there is a peak in demand for fossil fuels, or when the world goes from 100% fossil fuels to 90 to 50 down to 20. Actually, as soon as new entrants start to take away market share, that's when financial markets react. And so this isn't a risk for 5 years' time or 10 years' time. This is a risk today. And those following markets or have shares in companies like Exxon would have already seen what has happened. So we'd probably be best known for coining the phrase the carbon bubble. And I want to run through this quite quickly. What you're seeing on the slide here is the three key fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas. And what you're looking at is this huge spike in emissions that have occurred not from 50 years ago, though that certainly happened, but it's already happened in the last 20 years. It's all happened within probably the lifetimes of most of us here. And it's the cumulative emissions of carbon dioxide. We've got the highest concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than we've seen for over 400,000 years. We've done it in about 30 or 40 years. It's a blink of an eye if we think about it. And we really don't know the consequences because we've just not experienced this before. And that's the thing, that's the risk that we're all aware of. So how much more can we admit to the atmosphere? The science behind this is difficult. I'm not going to say I'm the expert, but we've emitted 2,350 gigatons, that figure in the middle, over the years. And the remaining budget, how much can we squeeze into the atmosphere? And I hate to think that we can squeeze some more, but that science reckons that we can probably squeeze in about maybe another 495 gigatons of CO2. A lot of it's going into the oceans, but it allows us to create a clock. And if you look at the bottom right of the screen my screen, you'll see the dates. We're probably going to run out of time of 1.5 degrees in about 10 years time, and then 2 degrees, and then 3 degrees, maybe 20, 30 years. Doesn't mean we'll hit those temperatures that we are with 1.5. It means we create the conditions for those temperatures. So how much more fossil fuels are there out there? This is the shocking statistic for me. This is a study we did. What you're seeing is a series of bars of cumulative carbon dioxide embedded in the reserves of coal, oil, and gas. The red is the coal, the light blue is the gas, the darker blue is the oil. And what you see along the bottom is a series of horizontal lines. That's the remaining carbon budget to this 1.5 degrees that we must need to keep to. And it's declining because we're running out of budget. There's 7 times more fossil fuels that we know about that are out there that we can possibly burn. And yet every year we're spending, well, in the case of Chevron and Exxon, tens of billions of dollars more in finding even more fossil fuels. We're making the carbon bubble even bigger. And here's a pathway that we need to drop emissions by and production by to achieve this net zero carbon goal that we hear about for 2050. How does that compare to the companies that we own in our portfolios? Pretty much nearly all of them are planning huge increases, major increases in production of oil and gas. And it's really that we call the stranded assets. It's that difference that will have to stay in the ground that we need to think about. So what I'm showing here is the steep pathway down, how demand for fossil fuels has got to drop. And we've built an enormous fossil fuel system. I want to be clear, it's helped humanity to get out of poverty, to rise living standards. It's done an amazing job for industry, for livelihoods, for heating, for jobs. But we must say thank you. Your time is now gone. Now's the time to move to a different system. And as we move to that different system, we've got $10 billion of energy supply infrastructure and $22 trillion of demand infrastructure in place, pipelines, oil refineries, platforms, rigs that we've built to support this fossil fuel-based system. We're going to have to write down all of that in the next decade or two. 25% of global equity markets, which is where our savings are invested, and 50% of non-financial corporate bonds are linked in one way or another to the fossil fuel economy. And there's going to be write-downs, depreciation, liabilities for cleaning up the mess. Who's going to decommission the gas station and pay for its cleanup costs as electric vehicles take over? And can incumbents really pivot? When a company spends 5% of its balance sheet on renewables as an oil company, can we really say that they're leading the transition? So a lot of change has to happen. So in the can't burn it all, I'm going to turn to some of the economics. Those of you familiar with what's been happening with the oil and gas sector, what you're seeing here is what's called a cost curve. And it's very simple, actually. On the left is the break-even price to get the oil out of the ground. If you live in Saudi Arabia, you just have to sink a hole down a few tens of feet and you're on oil. It's very cheap to produce. But if you're in the middle of nowhere, out in the Arctic or the sea, or you're going to produce this oil at very high costs, all the way up at $150 a barrel. And what you've got there, this curve, the blue, is a series of hundreds of projects, thousands of projects, and with different break-even prices. Why is this important? Is oil today is around $55 a barrel. And when this was written by our friends at Bloomberg, they're the ones who put the zombies on, oil's at $70 a barrel. And if you move that red vertical line a little bit to the left, it just simply makes the point that most of that oil out there, it's difficult to extract, it's costly, costs have gone down, but it makes the whole sector uneconomic. This is an industry that says we'll generate super profits, we'll get it out at $10 a barrel, we'll sell it at 80. Now, those days when it happened were terrific. I mean, investors made money. But the simple maths in the finance world is that if you're producing oil at $50 a barrel and you're selling it at $50 a barrel, there's no return on investment there. And that's the threat, really, so to the industry. Now, where does this link to climate? So Carbon Tracker, we have a very simple understanding of what we need to do to keep all that oil and gas in the ground. We build a model that looks at the highest cost producers, we reckon they're going to lose, the lowest cost producers will survive, and then we impose a climate constraint over the top. So with this next slide, on the left, you see the same cost curve, but what we've imposed on it is different International Energy Agency scenarios for warming. The one that's best aligned with well below 2 degrees is the one far to the left, the below 2 degrees scenario, the B2S, that light green vertical bar. And that kind of tells you that most of that planned production is going to really, really challenged. So everything that's in the middle, in our view, is what's going to have to be kept in the ground. All of our research at carbontracker.org, you can download, it's free, it's funded by foundations, and they've allowed us to look at every single oil and gas company, and that's what you're looking at the right, all those names. What proportion of their planned investments are actually outside of the Paris goals, outside of the Paris climate agreement? And as you can see, most of the production by companies, including the Exxons and the Concho Resources and the Suncors, just don't fit. And that really is the compelling case, that if your business doesn't fit, you're a high-cost producer. We're building financial arguments, not moral arguments, though they're important, to divest from fossil fuels. And the other secret, really, of the industry is the more money they invest, this is what you're looking at here on the left, look at the capital expenditure that these companies deployed even just a few years ago. The returns on capital, which is the 3-year moving average on the right. I know maybe this may be a bit difficult to follow, but it just simply illustrates the point that the return on capital has been collapsing. And that's the reason why so many investors are bailed out. It's getting expensive, the return on capital is falling, the amount of money you have to invest to get what you get is rising, you're in difficult parts of the world, regulation is against you. And so Carbon Tracker, we've identified project by project everything that has to be dropped. And here's just some more names, you can get them from the web. I don't need to stop here, but it just makes the point. So much of this has to stay in the ground. It's these projects that create the risks that we've seen in the industry. So the other thing, and this is just as I move to my conclusions, is technology that is really going to destroy. In the past, if you wanted to get from A to B, you needed to go to the gas station. And the only way you could do it is if you had a gasoline car, not an electric car, you had to pay the price of the pump. There's nothing you could do about it. But what's true today now is there's new competition. Tesla, electric vehicles, hybrid vehicles, fuel efficient cars. All of these means that now there's competition. And if prices go up at the pump, consumers by and large can switch and find a cheaper alternative. And the costs drops, whether it's for solar modules, wind turbines, or batteries, have collapsed over the last 10 years. So it's become so much cheaper. The learning rate for every doubling in the production of a battery, costs drop by 20%. It's called the learning rate. We've seen it with microchips, we've seen it with laptops, and now we're seeing it with wind and solar. And it's really this technological revolution that is the threat to the industry. And we've seen now that in the US, renewable energy consumption surpassed coal for the first time in 130 years in 2019. That little green bar, renewables, catching up and taking over from coal. It's great news. Is it enough? Well, that's what we have to see. And the economics are conclusive. 1 ton of petrol or gas every year for 15 years has a lifetime cost of $10,000. And the economics, one electric vehicle needs 2 kilowatts of solar panels, about 6 panels only, to last for 30 years. And the lifetime cost of powering a car, an electric vehicle, is $800. And it's really that which has made the whole of the oil and gas industry uninvestable in the last 2-3 years, and why we've seen the dramatic reversal. So as I conclude, you know, a few years ago, the balance of forces looked like the left, the fossil fuel lobbyists, the challenge of energy independence and security, the feasibility of projects, NIMBY, not in my backyard, inertia, and then high costs, renewables weren't competitive. And we were arguing, oh, it's about global warming and pollution. Well, today, and the Biden announcements of the last 48 hours, we have geopolitical advantage. We have the agenda, we have technology leadership, we have an energy security from renewables, energy justice, lower cost, the threat of global warming. And now the balance has been tipped conclusively. And we see it in the markets. The idea that the gradual narrative, oh, Mark, this is all going to happen in 20 years' time, we don't need to worry about it today. Fossil fuels will only peak in demand. It's actually how markets react. And I won't stop here, but the market share of electric vehicles is absolutely booming internationally. So how do financial markets, let's get back to the financial arguments, how do they react? The idea is that somehow, so long as volume, so long as the market share of fossil fuels remains high, then people think, well, of course, why should anything happen to my stocks? Well, actually, markets always peak and share prices drop just as growth peaks and new companies come in. That was the reason why Tesla very early on became worth more than all of the other traditional motor car manufacturers combined together. We saw something else happen similar. Do you remember when Amazon, with just 1/10 of the turnover of Walmart, was becoming more valuable than Walmart? For the simple reason that markets, investors discount the future and they derate stocks far before significant changes to volumes. Now, this is the theory. Has it played out in practice? Well, the answer is, well, yes. Here shows the performance of oil services and world coal and European utilities versus the S&P 500 over the last 10 years, and how the energy sector relative to the S&P has collapsed. And here's a lesson of history. Incumbents rarely survive disruptive change. And here shows the performance of the Dow Jones Coal Index and the Bloomberg World Coal Index. World coal demand peaked in 2013, and that's when the stock started to collapse. And actually, by the time that global coal demand was only 2.5% below its peak of 2013, the sector had lost 80% of its financial value. And finally, in 2020, after 90% of the financial value had been lost to investors, the International Energy Agency finally admitted that coal demand had peaked. So markets react before the peak, and that's the lesson for investors, essentially, that this is an outstanding risk. Here's ExxonMobil versus Next Era. For the first time, a renewable energy company became worth more than Exxon. And have the oil and gas companies missed out on the rally? There's been a slight jump recently, but this shows you how clean energy has essentially, investors are buying the future and saying goodbye to the past. And this is my last slide. What we're seeing is a technology-driven investment. In the past, Exxon and Chevron may have dominated, but we've seen it in the past. Kodak, you remember Kodak, they had a digital film business. They decided to double down on traditional film, and they sold their digital business. Peabody Energy, just before it went bust, said the future is rosy. And there's Blockbuster. When Netflix arrived, did people say, let's engage, did shareholders of Blockbuster say, let's engage with the board of Blockbuster for 5 years about how they can respond to live streaming? No, they didn't. What actually happened is investors in Blockbuster said, taking videos back to a store, who does that anymore? We could live stream, and everybody bailed out and bought Netflix. It was a very simple technological transition. And I think, and I'd like to pose to you today, that history is actually not going to just repeat itself, it's already repeating itself, and that this is no going back. And now's the time, really, to seriously review how risk is being managed in everyone's portfolios. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mark. Okay, so I saw some questions in the chat. Maybe Mark, while Rabbi Contraster is talking, maybe you can look through the chat a little bit so that when we come to discussion later, that can be woven in and you'll have had time to digest a little bit. So Rabbi Rachel Contraster is now going to tell us about her work in divestment, and particularly in the Jewish community, sometimes just the term divestment is a little bit like triggering. So you can share from your experience what you've learned through engagement with that. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. It's really exciting to be. So I am the Deputy Director at True for Human Rights, and I'm also the Vice Chair of the Board of the Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility, which is a 50-year-old coalition of faith and values-based investors who have been using their financial assets to make change, and working on climate is one of their big issues. And I know that looking at who's here, that we're a mixed group of people, some of us representing institutions, just wondering also some of us what we can do as individuals. And I think we're dealing with two questions, right? Like one, how do I or my organization, how do we not benefit financially from being invested in fossil fuels? And sometimes we also want to know, not just how do I screen out fossil fuel companies and divest from them, but also how do I use my financial leverage maybe to challenge companies to do better? And I think we all really want to know that we can make a difference. One thing I found is that no one seems to think that they have enough money to make a difference. But we know from other types of organizing that collective action adds up. If you're not an individual, but you're a group of friends or a collection of synagogues and institutions with financial resources, if you come together, you will have more of an impact. I also think we have to think about the ways that economic activism work. So economic activism can damage sales, right? When people divest from fossil fuels companies, when investors divest, it limits how much the resources they have to do their work. But divestment also damages brands. So that even if we may not individually or as an organization have a lot of money, so we think I can't really have an impact, the mere announcement that we have divested from fossil fuels can have a big impact. So let's think about it, for example, what happens when a major educational institution decides to divest from fossil fuels. For example, Columbia University did recently, and so have a number of academic institutions. first of all, they're not saying we don't have enough money to make a difference. They're saying it matters to us that we're not directly having an impact on the warming of our planet. But they're also listening to the voices of activists on their campus who are saying we don't want to be part of a campus that's invested in fossil fuels. And they're thinking about their brand to their students, right? That as an educational institution, it matters to them and to their community that they're not invested in fossil fuels. And Mark mentioned that the Rockefeller Foundation, which is a very large foundation of over, I think, $4 or $5 billion in assets, just announced that they were divesting. And what they said was, it's time to officially align our internal investment strategy with our external values and mission. And so they're committing to divest from fossil fuels, they're committing not to invest more, and they're also committing to invest in clean energy. And that's really important to say that, we think a lot as Jews who are committed to repairing the world about what are our values, and one of the ways we live out our values is through where we put our money. So what's the message that we send? Like, people of faith, we know from other forms of activism, are unique bearers of moral messages, right? We can say sometimes things that secular activists can't say. And so when the Jewish community or other people of faith say that we won't use our financial resources to support the destruction of the planet, it matters, right? We bring a specific voice and the voice of our tradition into the conversation. That being said, I think the Jewish community has historically thought a lot about how we use money as tzedakah, where we give our money, but we don't think as much about the power of money itself, or we don't think about organizing our money. But the Jewish community has long used economic activism, including long support for striking workers. We have a Jewish history of doing boycotts, but it's also important that we use our leverage as a community, not just in the political arena. We do political accountability. I think the Dayenu Coalition did a lot of work, for example, during the election to make sure that climate change was on the political agenda and supporting candidates who were committed to, for example, rejoining the Paris Climate Accord. But we also have to think about how we use our leverage for corporate accountability, that the Jewish community is holding corporations responsible for the decisions that they make. And for those of us who make investment decisions, we can't just say, oh, well, we can't just hide behind fiduciary duty, the obligation to make money. When the system of making money is flawed, like, we have to say, what does it mean that our investments might, maybe making more money right now because they're invested in oil? And not only do we have to talk to these to think about risks in our investment, we also have to think about how we present our case. Human rights activists often talk about making the moral case for human rights to businesses, that it's the right thing to do, versus the business case, that it's better, more strategic for a business. It reduces their risk to make this change, for example, to divest from fossil fuels. But sometimes it can feel hard, like companies should do the right thing, not because it's going to hurt their bottom line if they don't, but also because they're part of our global community. And so we have to learn to speak finance. We start with the moral case, and then we bring up these issues of risk, but we really have to push that the companies have an obligation to think differently about people and planet. So one obviously really major area that we're seeing in climate is divesting, that institutions are divesting both from fossil fuels, or we've seen examples where Jewish institutions have divested from banks that are invested in fossil fuels. For example, Kolot Chayenu, which is a synagogue in Brooklyn, became the first synagogue to divest from Chase Bank because of their investment in fossil fuels. So our smaller community institutions can leverage their money. I don't think we can say we don't have enough money so that it doesn't matter. That's actually really, stepping away from our responsibility. There's impact investing, so we can proactively put our money in projects that make a difference. I would say at the moment, though, impact investing, while really important in supporting good projects, doesn't have the power at the moment to really move sectors. But institutions and sometimes retail investors can also use our leverage financially, not just to divest, but also to do shareholder engagement, to put pressure on institutions such as banks, or on the fossil fuel companies themselves to do better. As I mentioned, I'm the vice chair over at ICCR, and we've done a number of campaigns to put pressure on the finance behind the fossil fuel companies to get them to do better. For example, there have been shareholders who have engaged with American banks to adopt policies on climate risk that include making sure that they're aligned with the Paris Agreement goals of a degree of warming of less than 2 degrees, and that we've also urged banks to shift their lending and their underwriting and their investment to support a decarbonized economy. Because we don't, it's hard to imagine investing in a fossil fuel company just to do engagement. We don't want to benefit from their work, but we might want to use our investments in other companies that are more morally neutral, like a bank, to really make a difference. There's been a lot of investor work on climate lobbying because the fossil fuel companies, oil and gas companies, both themselves and through their trade institutions like the US Chamber of Commerce, spend hundreds of millions of dollars lobbying to block or delay federal and state regulations designed to avert the climate crisis. So not only do we have to support the politicians who are going to stand up to them, but we also have to work against that type of corporate lobbying. So ICCR launched a campaign to assist investors to engage companies on transparency around their advocacy on climate, so that we're finding out not just what the companies are doing themselves, but also what their trade organizations are doing, because often those trade organizations don't have to disclose how much money they're spending lobbying against lobbying against regulation. So we can use our financial leverage to make sure that the goals that we're trying to see in legislation and regulation aren't undermined. Investors are also getting really involved in what's called the just transition. The just transition is really important. As we transition to a clean energy economy, people are going to lose their jobs. And sometimes those jobs, even if, say in coal, they're destructive to the planet, but they're well-paying unionized jobs. And the jobs that are coming in place don't necessarily replicate either the wages, and they might not be in the same place. And so rather than ignoring that, bringing together stakeholders like labor and human rights and people focused on inclusive growth, to focus on bringing workers and communities through this transition to a clean economy, people with investments can really push companies to be part of a strategy around just transition. The other thing we can do is look at corporate boards, so that they understand that climate change is a major investor risk, that it's the responsibility of the boards of organizations of companies whose job it is to sort of to govern the company and make sure that it's not taking unnecessary risks, that addressing climate change is critical in corporate governance, and that people who are investors have the opportunity and power to hold public companies accountable. And so there are a number of campaigns on that as well. I encourage everyone to look up an organization called Climate Majority Action that is holding, for example, big asset managers like BlackRock accountable on their climate votes, so that we know that they're voting for that they're voting in favor of shareholder resolutions on climate risk. That we hold electric utilities accountable to net zero carbon targets. So if you're invested in a major utility company, that we can make sure that their boards are pushing them towards these net zero climate targets. And we can also make sure that major financial institutions don't bring onto their boards people who have involvement in the fossil fuel industry, who are then going to push them away from, stopping to invest and underwrite fossil fuel companies. So this is a lot. I think I moved from what we can do as individuals, how we can divest, to also how we can organize our money to make change. But I do think it's really important to understand that when we're looking at climate, really using our financial leverage is an important piece of the puzzle to fight climate change. We have to obviously, organize and support political candidates who are going to make climate and climate justice a key priority, but it doesn't stop there. We can make sure that our institutions of any size, big and small, are not financially benefiting from fossil fuels, and we can use our financial resources to lobby the companies that might listen to us to make changes in their business operations.
Thank you, Rachel. Okay, so also you will see lots of chats that are directed your way. So maybe while Nikhil talking, you can react a little bit and think about what's the most critical to say when we all are talking. Nikhil is going to talk about how AJWS was the first Jewish organization to divest fully from fossil fuel holdings. So can you please tell us, why'd you do it? How'd you do it? Was there anything surprising about the process? Anything you think would be helpful? Because
Sure.
you're making the roadmap. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephanie. Can you hear me? Great. All right. Thank you again for this opportunity to share with you all. And my name is Nikhil Aziz, and I'm the director of the Land, Water, and Climate Justice program at American Jewish World Service. I want to just say a few words about who we are as an organization, because not all of you might be familiar with us. So American Jewish World Service, AJWS, is a public foundation that was begun in 1985. And we work in about 18 different countries across the global south, in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and the Caribbean, to fight poverty and pursue justice. Now, we do this through grant making and advocacy. Grant making to social movements and grassroots organizations in the areas of land, water, and climate justice, which I direct, civil and political rights, sexual health and rights, and humanitarian response. And this focuses on the rights of some of the most marginalized communities around the world in the global south. And then advocacy is focused on US policies that have an impact on those communities, because as Latin America, we always hear when the US sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold, right? And so we feel it's important as a US-based organization to also focus on US policy. And in my portfolio, and land, water, and climate justice, we have a number of different priority communities that we support: indigenous peoples, small farmers, fishers, foresters, including women, in 13 different countries. Now, why climate justice? Because for us, it is an approach to addressing the climate crisis that prioritizes root causes and systemic solutions. So for example, in our portfolio, we focus on industrial agriculture and fossil fuel-based energy, which is what we're really talking about today, which are two of the biggest drivers of climate change, that also violate the natural resource rights of communities like indigenous peoples and small farmers through land and water grabs and deforestation. Now, climate justice for us means that, one, those who did the least to cause the problem, these communities that I'm talking about, must not be made to bear the brunt, its biggest brunt. And that, two, because they are on the front lines of the crisis, they must also be at the forefront of change. I'm going to share today with you our process at AJWS, which I categorize in sort of four broad buckets: moral values and mission alignment, evidence-based advocacy, and stakeholder buy-in. I think Rahel talked a little bit about that too, and so did Mark, in terms of the importance of that, being intentional, and then finally, Divest, Invest. Now, it was important for a mission-driven organization like AJWS to align the organization with our mission at all levels. It was even more important because we are a faith-rooted organization that espouses the Jewish values of Tikkun Olam and B'Tselem Elohim, which guide our programmatic work of grant making in the global south and the advocacy work in the US. And they are perfectly in sync with our vision of climate justice. And so I think for us, it behooves us as AJWS, it behooved us to ensure that these values are also manifested internally within the organization. And that includes our financial investments. Now, this is often where I think organizations, especially in philanthropy, flounder. Now, for private and family foundations, the IRS requires that annually they expend at least 5% of their assets averaged over 3 years. And that includes operational costs. So it's not all grants. Essentially, what this means is if their investments are not aligned with their values and mission, all the good that they do with the 5% or usually less through their grants pales in comparison to the harm that 95% of their investments might be doing through supporting fossil fuel production or industrial agriculture, water privatization, or land grabs. So it's really, really encouraging to hear the news today that someone within philanthropy, a giant within philanthropy, the Rockefeller Foundation, has decided to divest, right? So imagine 95% of its 5 billion assets, which were not necessarily involved in the sort of the good side of things, are now going to be involved, at least in not doing the bad things. So as a public foundation, which is what AJWS is, without an endowment and the need to annually raise our entire budget for our programs and operations, the financial health of our reserves is even more important. Now, compared to many other public charities, AJWS has been fortunate. We were able to raise nearly 25 million as a reserve fund that we set up in honor of our former president, Ruth Messenger, to recognize her 18 years of leadership. But it was very clear to us on staff and board that this was also a moral argument to make. That if a fundraising organization like AGWS, which raises its annual budget, could commit to divestment from fossil fuels based on our values, then endowed foundations like the Rockefellers, without that need to raise the money, had absolutely no valid excuse to do so, to not to do so. And so we began having these internal conversations that were needed to make this decision. We knew that stakeholder buy-in was absolutely crucial, and no more so than that of the organization's trustees, our board, which bears, as we've heard, fiduciary responsibility in ensuring the financial health of the organization. So working with our then Vice President of Finance and our President, Robert Bank, we began having conversations with our board's finance committee. Now, our board members, I must say, were immediately convinced on the moral argument and mission alignment, but they also were very clear that they needed their concerns around fiduciary responsibility addressed. So we brought in colleagues from other organizations that had experience with this to share with our board. So Ellen Dorsey, the executive director of the Wallace Global Fund, which is an endowed family foundation based out of Washington, D.C., has been a leader in this field, both the foundation and Ellen herself. So we invited her to come and speak to our board about how divesting from fossil fuels and investing in clean energy alternatives actually met their fiduciary responsibility, given how, as Mark was describing, the return on investments were increasing solidly. And we also spoke with trustees and staff at other values foundations, the Libra Foundation in the Bay Area, the Chorus Foundation in Boston, and the Swift Foundation also in the Bay Area, to learn how they had engaged on this journey, particularly their trustees. So these conversations really helped our board to move forward with some important initial steps. One was to develop an investment philosophy, because we really wanted to be intentional about have aligning our investments with our mission and values at the very core of it, to lead these efforts. The second, agreed to join as the first Jewish organization, something which brings together faith-based organizations, environmental groups, and other stakeholders working to support just and sustainable energy access for the world's energy poor. For foundations like AGWS, signing on to the SHINE campaign meant committing at least 1% of our grant making and or our investments to sustainable energy access. So this is also on the positive side of things. While we also hired a consultant, his name is Steve Godecki, from among a pool of candidates who specialized in values-aligned investing that took environmental and social considerations, among others, into account. Now, Steve was very methodical. He interviewed the entire board and the leadership of the organization, as well as many staff members, to develop an investment policy that aligned with their values and also across all of our thematic work. So it wasn't just my area, land, water, and climate justice, but the other issue areas as well, because we really wanted our investments to align with our mission and our values across all of the work we did. So following the adoption of the investment policy, the investment committee then began to search for investment advisors from a pool of firms that specialize in values and mission aligned investing. And there are many of those, and I'm happy to provide a whole list of those people who might be interested as part of the resources. We, in the end, decided to go with a firm called Cornerstone, which not only met our, but were themselves also committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion, which AWS has taken up institutionally as a core of
Nikhil, I think your internet, is everyone else having trouble hearing him? Your internet is a little bit wonky and now you're frozen.
So working very closely with
me.
Can you hear me?
Now we can hear you. I think it's better
Right.
with your camera off. Sorry.
Sure, no problem. Thanks. I'm sitting in Bombay, and normally Bombay doesn't have any issues, but for some reason the last day or two I have been having some. So I'll just keep my video off for right now while I'm talking. Thanks. So we decided last year to formally sign on to the Divest Invest pledge that foundations like Wallace Global and others have championed. And I'm really proud to say that while the Reform Rabbis Pension Board was the first Jewish organization to divest from coal 2 years prior, AJWS, as Stephanie mentioned, is the first organization, the first Jewish organization to divest fully from all fossil fuels. But our board actually went further than that, which was to also divest from all extractivist industries more broadly, such as timber and mining and mega hydropower. And it also included aligning our investments with other grant-making portfolios and such as civil and political rights by not investing in industries such as defense and prisons. So ultimately, I think for our board, they were concerned both with the fiduciary and the moral obligations as a mission-driven organization, and saw their decision as a both and, not either or. It was a moral decision, and it was also a fiduciary decision to divest from fossil fuels. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to answer any questions later on in the question and answer session.
Thank you. And Nikhil, if you could put in the chat at the part where you said who you chose to help you do the investment, it went out for a minute. So maybe you could put a few of the names in the chat. Thank you. Okay. All right. Now we're going to turn to Melissa. So now we had a public foundation that talked about how they did it. And now we have a youth leader on a campus. So you were part of helping to get Vassar to divest from fossil fuels. So will you tell us if you have any suggestions for other people in the audience who might be thinking oh, I'm a person in college, or there were some people who said, oh, my kids are in college and they're doing this. Why did you choose to act on this? What did you do? Where did you find friction that you weren't anticipating? Tell us about how it went and what you would like people to know about it.
So unfortunately, we haven't divested, but I think that eventually we will get there. But our divestment campaign started in 2012, and a lot of other divestment campaigns were starting around the country. And students have been working on it ever since. We've submitted proposals to our board of trustees. They are our target in trying to get the institution to divest. We have about $1 billion endowment. And while we recognize that Vassar divesting won't have a significant impact on financial markets, it has very strong social impact, and will encourage other colleges and universities and institutions to divest and do the right thing. Our current messaging is we're focusing on how we can't be carbon neutral without divesting. Our school has a lot of climate commitments that we are working on. Vassar committed to be carbon neutral recently, and a lot of that was due to student divestment activists fighting for climate action on campus. So we got Vassar to commit to that. We also have a climate action plan that sets targets for emissions reductions, and students believe that in order to be carbon neutral, we need to also have our investments be carbon neutral and pull out of the fossil fuel industry. We know that it's been shown that fossil fuel investments are not really profitable right now, and they're in the long term they won't be. So it's really important financially as well to divest. We also work with other colleges to learn from what other campaigns have been doing. I'm part of the College Climate Coalition, where a bunch of universities and colleges across the United States that focus on climate justice and winning collective liberation for people on campus and dismantling systems of oppression on our campuses and off campus, because we recognize how fossil fuels are really bad for the planet as well as for people most impacted by climate destruction. And so we believe in reinvesting in communities that have been hurt by the fossil fuel industry. We've done a lot of different tactics to get Vassar to divest. We've reached out to the Board of Trustees. One of the challenges is that they're very hard to talk to. Some of them are open. However, the trustees that are supportive of divestment won't publicly speak out about it just because they don't want, because of other trustees are very against it and they don't want to impact their image. Some trustees that have been against divestment believe that it could damage their investment portfolios, and they say it's ineffective in driving social change. This we know is wrong based on a lot of research students have done, and just like so many academics have studied the effects of divestment and how it can be really positive for your investment portfolios. So getting trustees to change their mindset and realize how effective divestment could be for actually achieving the mission of the college is our goal. We believe that Vassar and other colleges, we can't commit to like educating our students about the importance of truth and seeking knowledge and critical thinking if we're investing in an industry that has historically tried to hide climate action and has been invested in climate denial. So we believe that it's just a really, it's kind of hypocritical for us to say we're supportive of climate action while also being invested in fossil fuels. Some tactics that some universities are doing are filing complaints with the state attorney general, calling on the attorney general to investigate schools for their for not wanting to divest from fossil fuels and compelling the school to divest. These complaints can be a really strong way of showing the trustees how serious the issue of fossil fuels are, and also shows how committed and serious students are about this issue and how well researched we are. This isn't just like students making noise, but this is like a real concern. So there are some reasons why filing complaints with the Attorney General can be effective. Colleges have argued that by investing in fossil fuels, trustees violate their fiduciary duty, which is their responsibility to act in the best interests of the college. They also fail to consider the charitable purposes of the institution. Colleges have to comply with state laws about prudent management of institutional funds. And we argue that that investing in fossil fuels is not a prudent management of the funds of the school. Investing in fossil fuels, trustees also violate their duty of loyalty to the Vassar or college community. The trustees must consider their assets' relationship to the charitable purposes of the institution. They also violate their duty to act in good faith by funding an activity that directly imperils the lives and prospects of young people and college students. It also poses a risk to Vassar College property if we're thinking about long-term effects of climate change and how it can cause lots more of natural disasters that could be a liability to the college. Trustees also violate their duty of care. Students, faculty have warned that investments in fossil fuel companies are immoral, financially risky, and also based on fraudulent information. Fossil fuel companies try to lobby the government to deny lots of climate change and deny the severity of climate change, which is really harmful for thinking about future impacts of what kind of life that young people will be experiencing in the future. So our campaign, we're committed to calling out the hypocrisy of our schools' commitments to climate action and carbon neutrality while still being invested in climate destruction. We believe that divestment is also really important. It can be a really useful campaign for educating people about climate change by showing the connections between the fossil fuel industry and climate destruction, and also educating our fellow students about how they can get involved and take action on climate change, because it can feel kind of, I guess, really overwhelming to think about where to start in terms of taking action. But if we work together and sort of work at targeting our university and the most powerful people that have the ability to make change, we can actually have a really important impact. And so I would recommend for people who are trying to get started on divestment is to read more about other schools that have divested, and also look into your institution's investments in the fossil fuel industry and the connections that the trustees have to fossil fuel companies, or even like banks that fund fossil fuels, such as like JP Morgan Chase. They're a really big company. They're a really big investor in fossil fuels. We actually have a trustee on our board of trustees that has worked with JP Morgan very closely, and so we think that her being on the board is impacting our trustees' choice to divest, because she's so, I guess, closely connected with a bank that's so notorious for funding climate destruction. Other tactics, some faculty at colleges that have TIAA, TIAA is a organization that funds retirement funds for colleges, and it's very also notorious for funding climate destruction, such as fossil fuel projects and deforestation. A example that's close to home for, I guess, Vassar College in like New York is there's a power plant in New York that is funded, or is about 35% ownership. TIAA has about 35% ownership in that plant. So it just shows how closely connected a lot of these big money managers are to fossil fuel projects. So some faculty at colleges are starting campaigns to get the school to divest from, or get TIA to divest from fossil fuels, because it's immoral for for them to make their retirement funds based off of climate destruction, and there's a better path forward. I can also send like links in the chat about some of these websites that can give more like more tools and information about divestment. But yeah, that's about it. I'm really happy to be working on my divestment campaign. I've learned a lot, and it's been really great to like educate other people about it. So
Thank you, Melissa. Okay, so first of all, this was a very robust chat, and I could see that many of the sort of comments were addressed. There were like a billion links. You could spend the rest of your life checking every resource that was added. But I want to invite, now that you've each had a chance to sort of take in the questions that were directed your way and heard each other, I want to do a quick opportunity. If there's one thing you feel like each of you would like to say, sorry, apparently there's a school break going on. Shh. Like in reaction to this, what feels the most salient? I did hear, like Mark, I'm thinking maybe you could go to Vassar. Like, are you speaking with boards of directors of universities?
Stephanie, to answer that question, we are. I regularly present to endowments and foundations, to the boards of trustees, to pension fund trustees, to Cambridge Associates and Mercer and all the investment consultants. Recently, I presented to the to the entire board of $1 trillion asset manager, to the main board and the chief investment officer. So we do that, and because we're funded by foundations, I don't have to worry about fees or anything else like that. We just do it to educate. That's our philanthropic purpose, to educate and inform trustees. And it's on a first come first served basis. I'm happy to get my investment banker colleagues to Carbon Tracker to help where we can, to support people. Often the consultants tend to be pretty entrenched, and they look backwards at risk, and they think that the past is repeated in the future. And that's why you got these things commonly known as the efficient markets hypothesis. Everything that is to be known is in prices, and that they measure risk in terms of what's called tracking error, the extent to which you diverge from the benchmark. It's a bit technical, but essentially what they're saying is if you don't own everything, you're risky. Now, what's going to happen in the world in the future is what the world's going to decarbonize technologically or whatever. And because of that, you almost have to redesign your investment beliefs, what you think the future looks like, and you have to amend your performance benchmarks. You have to amend what you're trying to do. And that's where it gets very tricky. And the consultants, in my experience, and the trustees, in my experience, have not really properly grappled with this. But other endowments have, and others have really done a thorough job. And the New York City pension scheme worked very, very hard with its consultants and its investment advisors before they announced their divestment last week. You would have seen the announcement. They've divested $4 billion of their $200 billion out of fossil fuels. So it's happening all around the world, literally all around the world, across Europe, across Asia, well, I mean, particularly Australia, and now America. And it's not a lonely exercise, Stephanie. It's one with plenty of fellow travelers with lots of data, lots of experience, and lots of rational decision making. This thing about fiduciary duty, I want to be clear, and I'm going to stop talking. There is no fiduciary duty to invest in a bad company. That's bad advice. Let's be clear about it. Thank you.
Thank you. Rachel, do you want to add something?
I would say, look, obviously, because of the conversation around divestment in other parts of the Jewish community, it's made it, I think people are very reticent to get involved in the campaign around divestment and economic activism around climate. And I would encourage you to work past that. Like this is a really important strategy for climate justice and for stopping global warming, and we need to take action now. And that's not just like that. There's a very strong moral argument for communities of faith to get involved in this. So this is a as I mentioned before, boycotts and divestment are a time-honored tactic used by both frontline communities and the people who support them to make change. And so I just think that we have to be bold here, and that this is an area that the Jewish community can't step back from getting involved in, and that includes our individual institutions. I also think that we have to talk to our federations about this. That in the Jewish community, whereas in the Christian denominations, most of the money is sort of in these large denominational funds. Although Nikhil mentioned the Reform Pension Board, which does amazing work, but for the Jewish community, a lot of the money is in our federation system through some Jewish institutions, but the federations and also in family foundations, and we have to pressure them as the sources of communal money to really make divestment and engagement with companies a priority.
Thank you. I will say personally, just listening to this, TIAA CREF is where our investments are for JTS, and also at other Jewish not-for-profits in the social justice world that I've worked in. So I feel like I'm leaving with some homework at least to go ask some questions. Nikhil, do you want to add anything? I can't see your face, which is fine because we'll be able to hear you. But do you have something to add?
Yeah. No, just to say that, I think that this is not just happening at the level of the $5 billion Rockefeller Foundation or the $4 billion whoever else, right? I mean, this is also happening up and down the chain. And so an organization like American Jewish World Service, like I said, we don't really have an endowment. What we do have is a reserve. And that's not the same as an endowment. And even then, I think we were able to, because did all the sort of evidence gathering, the conversations, we were very deliberate and intentional in how we did this, that we were able to bring our board on board. And so, just an encouragement to, I know there was one question in the chat about a synagogue with a small endowment. Absolutely, that's what you need to do, is to really encourage maybe perhaps your members to do that in terms of their in individual investments, and then collectively to make the pitch to the organization, to the synagogue. And then, once your synagogue does it, then you work with other synagogues. I mean, that's how you build the momentum, right? So I think there's lots of resources out there and definitely can be done. So don't think that this is only for the $5 billion endowments.
Thank you. I'm curious of any, like, I feel like one of the sort of robust parts of the chat was like thinking about all of the jobs that are going to be lost, all of the, like, the sort of what's lost and where could people who want to be investing time and effort in, like, a constructive different iteration. So is there anything any of you would like to say about that? And I also want to invite people in the chat, if there's any like commitment you're personally leaving this session with, like, I think it might inspire others to see, like, oh, somebody said they're going to do this, maybe I would do that too. So I'm opening it up around like alternative things people might do. Some people are going to leave here and be like, I am all about fossil fuel divestment, and that's where I'm going. And that's a little bit of an agitational thing to do, right? So there are going to be some people who are wired differently and they want to take on a different piece of this. So if there's any suggestions you want to make about people who want to see themselves on this journey, but maybe are not going to do all the divestment work, I open it up.
So both Nikhil and I put into chat some of the links to some of the groups doing the just transition, which is really, it's not just, those are roundtables of all stakeholders, not just, left-wing organizations, but really bringing together the people who are being most affected both by climate justice right now and the people who are going to, who could potentially lose their jobs. So everyone's come together to say, how do we preserve, make sure that people are employed, how do we make good jobs?
Raquel, do you want to turn off your camera for a second? Oh, I don't know what's happening, but we couldn't hear you so well.
I will turn off my camera. Is that better?
I think it's an audio issue.
Okay. Is that a little bit?
Yes, it's working now.
Weird. Okay. So what I was saying is both Nikhil and I put into chat the links to some of the groups doing just transition, which is really not just, which is really a multi, like really bring together all the stakeholders, people, frontline communities affected by, by the rising temperatures, labor organizations representing people who are going to lose their jobs, to really think strategically about how do we ensure that the transition to a just economy, the transition to a clean economy doesn't leave anyone behind. So it's not just like reassurances that everyone will be okay, but really saying to ourselves, how do we make, because that's how we bring everybody on board, when we really make sure that both people who are impacted now and people who are going to be impacted in the future have a chance to work together to see common solutions. Nikhil, I don't know if you want to add to that.
No, I think you said it, Rahel. Thank you.
Thank you.
There's another question in the chat that would be great to.
This question, what would a campaign look like to get Jewish federations and family foundations to divest? So I guess I want to open that up a little bit to the group. Like, this has been a hard one. What we have sort of heard is that the Jewish community has not really taken this on en masse, and we are a small coalition that is growing and sort of trying to enter with curiosity and agitational willingness to engage, but it doesn't seem like there's been a big campaign around federations and foundations in the Jewish community. So I guess I'm curious, I'm asking, does anyone in this group have any experience trying that you feel like it would be worthwhile to share here? I don't see any hands, but if you are a person who has that, you should feel welcome to say. Otherwise, that is an interesting observation that nobody does. observations. We should ask him a follow-up about. Okay. Are there any, we have just another minute or two. Are there other pressing questions?
Can I make an observation?
You may.
About 80% of the world live in energy importing countries, and they import their energy from some of the nastiest places in the world, from Russia, Azerbaijan, from Saudi Arabia, from Venezuela. And when we decarbonize, it's going to be a huge transfer of wealth to poor people in developing countries. They'll be generating their own electricity from locally made power from solar and wind. They won't need to import gas and oil or build pipelines across precious lands. And I see actually the decarbonization of the world will actually lead to strengthened democracies and the chance to bring democracy into parts of the world, whether it's Saudi Arabia or Russia, which are a threat to world peace and stability. And actually, it's the deal done by the West with these vicious countries that's led to a lot of conflicts. And producing clean energy locally at the community level will empower local people and create jobs. And we will live through this in our next 20 years. That's what I'm excited about. It's a new era that we're going to go through, driven by lower costs, new jobs, a cleaner air, and a safer planet.
Thank you. So I guess those were great words to nearly end on. And what I would say is, you know, we are now in the Jewish community in the Torah reading of Beshalach. And one of the things that's interesting that happens in it is there's sort of a taking from whatever present struggles they're having and memorializing it to bring it into the future. And so, you know, as the Israelites are wandering in the desert and they have no food and they have no water and they're pretty grumpy, and manna starts falling, one of the things that they do in addition to eating it and taking a double portion for Shabbat is they also save a little bit, sort of as a like, they're never going to believe this in the future, we better take it with us. And similarly, there are a few other places where there are monumental battles and they erect a memorial to a hard time. And so I'm sort of noting that there are a lot of really terrible and awful things about the time we're living through right now in COVID. And also, I don't think that this kind of big, bold climate fest would have happened at a different moment, because we've all been building the muscles over the last year for this kind of gathering across states, countries, continents. I mean, this is sort of an interesting thing that it has become so mainstream that over 3,000 people are participating in a climate fest in the Jewish community right now. And we're drawing on the experts from India and from England and from across this country. And so I want to encourage us, like, this is in lots of ways the beginning of a conversation. Our Jewish Climate Coalition seems to be taking some sort of small steps towards trying to normalize the conversation around fossil fuel divestment in the Jewish community. And it's really, there's an open opportunity. If you have energy for this and you want to be part of it, it really only happens when human beings decide, I'm going to spend some time and effort focusing on this. So it seems like what we have noticed here is that there's a gap in that the Jewish community hasn't really stepped up in this area. And there are some interested people on this call. And so if you want to, Morgan has been excellent about putting in the email for the Jewish Climate Coalition. If you want to sort of step up and say, hey, I might not want to be the leader, but I'm willing to like put in some time. We could think about doing this kind of presentation in other places. I think that you have to, like, every time I hear it, so I have now heard this twice and met with Mark a couple of times. This was the first moment that I said, oh, actually, TIAA Craft might be a place that I need to be spending some time. So this is really an invitation, and for us to take, like, sort of like the manna from this moment of remembering we know how to gather in this way, even when we're able to be more in person with the people who are more local, and to really sort of think about taking the next steps forward on this conversation. It might be personal. It might be deciding to actually go try to get the community you're really engaged in to divest, but it also might be coming together with some other folks to think about, do we want to do something bigger in the Jewish community? So thank you for spending some time in your day or night or whatever period of time this is for you with us. We're eager to be partners in whatever you might be interested to do in this arena. Mark, Rachel, Nikhil, Melissa, Morgan, like really thank you. This was a labor of love and an act of loving kindness and also justice to put this forward. And let's see where else we go. And please feel welcome to go to any other of the sessions in the Big Bold Climate Fest. And thanks for being here with us today.
Thank you.